Hello, welcome to the Nagorno-Karabakh miniseries, produced by Regional Post Caucasus in collaboration with Eastern Dialogue. In today's episode, we're going to talk about media, more precisely about international media. We have seen an influx of journalists, foreign journalists, during the Nagorno-Karabakh War, and today we're going to talk about how international media approached and covered the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict and war. Our speaker today is Neil Hauer, who is a Canadian freelance journalist, analyst, and a researcher writing on the North and South Caucasus. He has been living in the region for many years, and he has been reporting on the ground from all over, in Syria, in Chechnya, and he has been in the front lines of Nagorno-Karabakh War. His stories were published on CNN, Guardian, Foreign Policy, and AlJazeera. Neil, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
You've been covering the South Caucasus for a very long time. What is the most fascinating thing about the region for you as a foreign journalist?
I mean, I just thought I got into the region many years ago, basically in the middle of my undergrad degree, I guess, because I was always interested in the former Soviet Union, and then the Caucasus was basically the most interesting corner of the former Soviet Union. And I mean, it's just this intersection of so much history, culture, diversity, different languages, and societies going back thousands of years, and the amount of diversity and the amount of richness in such a fairly geographically small area just captivated me. And then even after living here for now about 3.5 years, I'm not anywhere close to having seen everything I want to. So it's a region that keeps on giving from it, and that I find very intellectually stimulating in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and you have covered a lot of wars in the region too.
Yeah, I mean, this is actually my first war covering on the ground, because I've never had the idea of being a war correspondent. I'm just a Caucasus-focused journalist and researcher, and so I've done. I travel to Chechnya about once a year in the North Caucasus, but that's largely sort of a post-war area now. And Syria, I write on analytically, so have not traveled there. Just write on, especially Russian foreign policy there. But when this conflict happened, of course, I had to. This is the biggest, frankly, the biggest event in the Caucasus since minimum 2008, the Russia-Georgia war. So of course, I had to come here, and there was no way I thought I could do it without covering it from the ground, from Karabakh, from Armenia, and yeah.
So with you, there were a lot of journalists. In fact, the ad hoc report from the Armenian Ombudsman says that there were around 390 journalists from 90 different countries, and more than 100 media outlets covering the conflict from the Armenian side. And yet we all had this feeling that a lot of international media outlets have overlooked the conflict in some way or misrepresented a lot of facts. Do you have any kind of explanation for this?
Yeah, I think in a lot of cases, especially for, I think in European media, it was fairly well covered, although, of course, I don't follow local national media for a ton of countries. And I did meet, for example, one Dutch journalist who came here only in mid-November after the ceasefire, and said she was basically the first Dutch journalist to come here. So I guess it didn't make it everywhere. But my sense was that in Europe, the coverage was not so bad. It was fairly widespread, I think. But especially American media outlets were largely disinterested. I tried to pitch pieces to a large number of American outlets, big ones that I've worked with before, and they just all passed. There was no bandwidth to get anything in there because, A, it's the pandemic, it's COVID time, and B, is the U.S. election. So there was no bandwidth at all to get anything into U.S. coverage. And then even major U.S. outlets, CNN didn't send anyone here and didn't commission any reporting from the ground. Washington Post didn't send anyone here, didn't commission any reporting from the ground. And the coverage, the bandwidth for the U.S. media especially was just not there. And so I think that's the biggest standout for me in terms of international media coverage.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think, in some way, was just world busy with Corona and everything, or for people, the conflict didn't have much relevance or much interest? Or they just, thought that Russia is going to handle everything. For them, it was a case solved.
I think it's a confluence of a lot of things. Of course, definitely the being pandemic and U.S. election time, that takes up so much of the bandwidth already. And then, journalism in the media sphere, journalism just being frankly a dying industry where every major outlet, local outlets have been shuttering for the last 20 years, and major outlets have, except for a handful, have shed staff and shed funding and have hugely contracted in the number of employees they have and the amount of space they have to write on different topics. And then the fact that this is it's occurring. I mean, it's on the edge of Europe, and it's a hot war and a very destructive war that's happening not far from basically on the borders of the European continent. But at the same time, it doesn't have that big selling point of, let's say, Russia's involved. Because I mean, I saw in the middle of the war, someone did an analysis of New York Times coverage of the 2008 Russia-Georgia war and then this war, and just searching for keywords in the New York Times. I think in 2008 they searched for Ossetia, and then this time they searched for Karabakh, and it was literally 20 times more coverage of the 2008 war than this one. Despite this one, lasting much longer and being much, much more destructive. I was shocked to see that it was that much of a disparity, literally 20 times. But yeah, so there's no big sexy news angle to it that you can say, oh, this is some Russian grand plan because everyone loves the Russian evil mastermind story. But it's the combination of loss of let's say three factors. Let's say the contraction of the media industry, the COVID pandemic and U.S. election, the loss of bandwidth there, and then the lack of any just immediate sort of sexy geopolitical angle you can focus on this.
Mm-hmm. And while being here and reading all those articles from journalists who have been on the ground and who have not been on the ground, like in the case of Washington Post, how would you say, are the stories representing the reality in some way? How would you characterize the coverage of the war?
I mean, I think a lot of it got better, definitely around for the last, let's say, 4 weeks of the war. I think it was definitely much better. But early on, especially, I think there was a lot of either simplistic stuff or false equivalency stuff. And the thing that was most glaring to me in the first 2 weeks was, when there was the strike on ganja, and then this suddenly made headlines, and that was the headline event that was reported everywhere. And just two weeks of concerted, constant, indiscriminate shelling of Stepanakert and every other town in Karabakh was mentioned either in passing in that piece and hadn't been brought up either. And this idea, and there was this idea that, oh, now this is some massive escalation because this is a city outside the conflict zone, as if, Stepanakert being well behind the front lines is just, that's just, of course, that they're going to, that's fine. That's not a newsworthy thing if there's indiscriminate shelling on this just civilian location, but this other one, that's a much bigger news. And I mean, there's a lot of, so that was a big issue earlier on. And then, I saw a lot of, even with bigger news outlets, I saw a lot of either failure to get certain facts and figures right, or failure to contextualize properly in terms of, I was reading that there's a New York Times report that came out the other day that was reported half from Karabakh, from the Armenian side, half from the Azerbaijani side. And most of the report was fine, but it opens with, it's saying Fuzuli, a town of 30,000, that was once 30,000 people. And I knew that was too high. And I looked up the last Soviet census, 1989, which is always the go-to basis for the numbers on these things. And Fuzuli was 17,000 people. So now, I don't know where they got 30,000 from. Maybe that was the Azerbaijani government figure and they didn't check it. But I also sent it straight to them and got the response back from the corrections. They haven't corrected it. And they also said, there's 800,000 Azerbaijani refugees or IDPs from Karabakh and the 7 surrounding regions. And the real number of that is more like 450,000, according to Human Rights Watch and the extensive report that they put out at the end of the conflict in late 1994. And maybe you get approach 800,000 people if you include the Azeris that were expelled from Armenia, but that's a different story as well. And so this number is just flat out incorrect, and that's in the story as well. And then there was also a lot of reporting that failed to differentiate between Karabakh proper, the former Karabakh Autonomous Oblast, and then the 7 surrounding Azerbaijani occupied regions of, Agdam, Fuzuli, Jabrail, Zangilan, Kubadli, Lachin, Kelbajar, which are, those are a completely different set of issues from the Karabakh Autonomous Oblast, which was the compact ethnic Armenian point of settlement. And this is if you get that wrong, then you've missed the fundamental basis of the whole conflict. And unfortunately, that was pretty widespread.
There were many videos appearing during the war. I think this war has been unprecedented in terms of the use of Telegram as a communication tool and as a tool to show or to boast of the crimes or of the success. And the video showing the mistreatment, torture, mutilation, and execution of the Armenian soldiers and POWs by the Azerbaijani army, and in occasional cases also vice versa. As a journalist, you have to watch all those videos to report on them. How do you manage the emotional side of it? What do you do to the point when it becomes too overwhelming?
That's a great question. I would love to know the answer to that. What should you do to manage it? Because I found it quite difficult because, I've covered Syria for years or followed it analytically, going back to 2012, 2013. I already since then followed it very closely. And so, I've seen all sorts of ISIS videos and everything. So I've seen stuff like this before too, but then to see, ISIS doing literally ISIS doing it is one thing, whereas an extremist, radical Islamist terrorist militia doing it is one thing, and then the armed forces of a state actor is something else. To watch the beheading videos that come out with Azerbaijani soldiers, the two different ones of Azerbaijani soldiers beheading live elderly civilian captives. So yeah, those are really hard to watch. I don't know how to really deal with it. I decided to stop watching these, and I don't, I'm not really sure what to tell people other than be prepared or just know what you're getting into if you want to do that. And I don't recommend it.
That is just too much to digest.
Yeah.
But the families of those people, like of the soldiers, had to watch every single video to make sure that their sons or brothers are not. So this war has been unprecedented in many ways. And you have mentioned about the false equivalency. And oftentimes when we mention that there has been these videos of mutilation and execution, we see as a response from the Azerbaijani side, hey, but there are also videos from your side. And we acknowledge that, and we condemn that. But as a foreign journalist, as someone who has no interest whatsoever in both countries or a bias, or maybe you do in some way, but can you tell me, is it possible to actually differentiate between a set of crimes that has a specific ideology or a systemic ground behind them, or videos of crimes where there is mostly individually perpetrated war crimes?
Yeah, I just think that there is a much larger basis for this sort of stuff in Azerbaijan in terms of, it's almost it's one of these things that obviously everyone in this region is aware of it, but I think a lot of people are not. But of course, the Ramil Safarov case, where this was a guy who was the infamous Azerbaijani soldier who in Hungary in 2004 at the NATO training exercise snuck into the where the Armenian officer was sleeping in the middle of the night and hacked him to death with the axe, and then was imprisoned for life in Hungary. Azerbaijan agitated to get him out for years. In 2012, they finally succeeded on the grounds that they would imprison him for life and uphold his sentence in Azerbaijan. And instead, he came back and, of course, was hailed as a hero and given back pay and apartment and promotion and et cetera, et cetera. And say what you will, that the Azerbaijani government has since stopped talking about him. Yeah, but okay, the example is there that if you brutally murder a defenseless Armenian, then you will be not only is it acceptable, but it's commendable. You will be rewarded for it. And I simply don't see the equivalent of that anywhere on the Armenian side. What can you say? You can point at some the equivalency things that the Azeris like to bring up include Asala stuff or Solomon Terlierian, the guy who beheaded Enver Pasha, killed Enver Pasha, which is a bit different, I think. But I think then the depth of the hatred. Obviously people here by and large do not like Azeris, do not like Turks, but it's to a different level. I think it's a much different circumstance here, where especially towards Turkey, it's sort of this historical resentment for the genocide, And in reality, plenty of Armenians visit Turkey and live and work in Istanbul, etc. But for Azerbaijan, I really think it's this inculcated state ideology of anti-Armenianism and this external enemy. And I mean, this is the classic sort of model that's used by repressive regimes to authoritarian dictatorships to justify their rule all over the place. And of course, it was used here as well too, in terms of the fact of we can't risk internal political turmoil because we have the external enemy to focus on. Same thing that was used by Arab regimes for literally 50 years before the Arab Spring. The emergency laws because we're at war with Israel. And then Azerbaijan, the same thing too, is the rally around the flag effect, which, as we saw, was extremely effective in this war. I mean, Azerbaijani civil society just fell in line. The Azerbaijani opposition was all completely in support of everything that Ilham Aliyev was ordering and doing. And Azerbaijan, this narrative of just really hatred and dehumanization towards Armenians, I think, is just at a really incredible level.
Do you think it's justified? Do you think those people can actually, if we take out this hatred from two societies, it's going to be possible to coexist together?
I mean, we are so far away from that I can't imagine how that happens in any reasonable time frame. I mean, essentially, now we're at the point where the dynamics of the conflict have basically flipped from what they were for the last 25 years, where, of course, at the end of the first war, Armenia was the satisfied victor and the Azeris were the aggrieved defeated nation. And so resentment there smoldered, and especially, of course, is understandable in the 500,000 people that were expelled from the regions from Karabakh and from the regions around Karabakh. But now we see it on the other hand, where it's flipped around. And now, I mean, before there would have been more onus on the Armenian side, I think, to make nice for this or to try and come to concessions, which there was attempts in the past, especially the late 90s and early 2000s, that unfortunately came to naught. But now it's flipped, and now the Azeris are the ones who are in the position where their grievances have almost effectively, all their legitimate grievances, as far as I'm concerned, have basically been solved. They always said we need people to be able to go back home. We need the regions back. Okay, now you have those 7 regions. Those are in your hands again. You even have a bunch of Karabakh. You have Shusha, which was always your biggest sticking point in the final status of Karabakh. The remaining areas, I mean, we're talking about maybe 10,000 Azeris that once lived in that area, which is, drop in the bucket compared to the 500,000. So now we're at the state where we're at the point where, in order for there to be something to move forward towards coexistence, there needs to be a lot of conciliatory moves by the Azeri side, a lot of magnanimity shown, and nuance and respect for the defeated, for the Armenian side. And of course, it's the exact opposite of what we're seeing and what we've seen from the Azerbaijani government for 15 years now, and there's no reason to think that it will stop. So I don't think, it's really nice to talk about, I hope we can live in peace one day, and we need to start building bridges towards it, and as some civil society member. But the reality is, the people in power who can affect this, and the winner of the war in the Azerbaijani government have shown no real interest in this at all. So just going by the reality is that I think deep down, everyone who is saying this, that we can peacefully coexist and we need to start working towards that, is aware of this reality, that this is something that the people at the very top seem uninterested in.
Unfortunately, and that's been one of the obstacles of trying to on the way to have a peaceful dialogue for the last 30 years. You have written an article about the clashes in July that happened in the northeast border of Armenia for foreign policy. And you have mentioned that those clashes, those skirmishes have been very different for 3 different reasons, because they took place out of Nagorno-Karabakh, because a lot of a famous general died. Do you think that those skirmishes were a signal of a full-scale war that the Armenian government somehow didn't actually notice or just pass by?
I don't think those were particularly indicative of anything. I mean, talking to people who were very well involved, I really like the quote that Alexei Vartanyan for International Crisis Group gave me for that piece, saying that if anyone was planning these clashes, they did a really bad job, because they really seemed to be, haphazard, the result of miscommunications. As best we could tell, is what happened is something like, there was an Azeri truck moving towards Armenian positions, or the Armenians thought it was moving towards their positions, and then it was fired upon, and then things just sort of escalated a bit from there. But certainly that's certainly not an area where either side wants conflict with. Of course, there's no dispute that the borders there are not exactly they're not fully demarcated, but they're not very disputed either. That's the internationally recognized boundary, so there's no incentive for either side really there. And then, of course, on the Armenian side, you have the main north-south highway in Armenia going to Georgia, and then the Azerbaijani side, you have the critical pipeline infrastructure right there too. So neither side really wanted that in particular. So I don't think those clashes per se were planned or part of this, or intended as the starting point for this. But in fact, they basically did end up serving as the starting point for the buildup. In that the weeks that followed, Turkey immediately announced that they were going to hold that. They immediately announced and then held the military exercises with Azerbaijan. And then, as we know, they left behind quite a bit of equipment, and also officers that helped coordinate the campaign over the last few months. And basically this kicked off the build-up on the Azerbaijani side too, where they began the coordination then. I think this is really where they began to think about launching the campaign, was just after that. And I think that's the point where the Turks began to really encourage them as well too, and really came down on their side forcefully for the first time ever in this conflict. Much more so than the previous diplomatic support and lower level ties that they always had. And then so in summary, I think that the clashes in July were not planned, but then they became the launching point. They became the point where everything that happened starting on September 27th, the planning for it started just after that. Yeah, and I mean, as far as I don't think there was any Bayraktar usage or anything in the July clashes. And I mean, the July clashes weren't particularly different from any other sort of skirmishes, except for where they took place, really, in terms of, the losses on either side were fairly even, maybe I think slightly favoring the Armenian side on those clashes. And no real territory changed hands, and there was no real indication from that Azerbaijan was going to be able to had built this force that was going to be able to really tear through Armenian defenses, as we saw later. So I don't think it really was a huge precursor in itself.
Mm-hmm. International community has been quite silent since the beginning of the war, although there has been a lot of proof of the existence of Turkish-backed Assyrian mercenaries, of the violation of the international humanitarian law, war crimes, use of cluster munitions, and all the different kinds of crossing of these red lines that happen. Why do you think, considering all of that, all the organizations, including the UN, OSCE, the Council of Europe, the EU, and the countries in general, have been so silent on the war and all the violations of international laws that happen over the course of it?
I mean, I frankly think that most of it is because that this, especially in the first month of the conflict, the conflict was taking place not only within the de jure recognized territory of Azerbaijan, but in the 7 regions surrounding it, which is even Karabakh itself is unfortunately a lot of the nuance is not going to be, and the understanding is not going to be present in a lot of international actors to understand to go beyond the fact that it's within the de jure borders, but these are Soviet era borders, and Karabakh itself is never under independent Azerbaijan's control, etc. But I mean, to have it happening in Armenian populated areas is one thing. And I think this is especially true with regards to Russia's response, in terms of, to have it happening in the Armenian populated areas is one thing, but to have all the combat happening in Jabrayil and Fizuli, that are these deserted wastelands that there was never any real justification for Armenia holding them, that I don't think that there was much sympathy for that on the Russian side, especially, as very well connected people in Moscow told me is that, the Armenians knew this, is that they took those areas by the strength of their own arms, and if they wanted, they could have given them back, but they decided they wanted to hold them. That's fine, but then that's the deal. It's like, we're not going to help you hold Jabrail. You have to do that yourself. If you've decided that that's so crucial that you have to have that, then that's it. And for the rest of, for the international community, I was actually pretty surprised in terms of the amount of opprobrium I saw directed towards the EU in general, in particular the EU as an institution, because the EU is not an institution that responds to things like this. I mean, it is institutionally incapable of that because it requires consensus from all 27 members, and even one is enough to stop it. I mean, as we saw with even putting sanctions on Belarus, that's one unrelated issue. Basically, Cyprus could just block that, and so the EU was never going to do anything, nor could it have, nor should people have expected it to, really, to put like some comprehensive sanctions on Azerbaijan or whatnot. Obviously, the US was in its own business, has had its own problems, and then I think that I definitely think that there should be some form of punishment towards Azerbaijan later on here. Especially given that once the fighting moved into the ethnic Armenian areas and we started getting like these horrific war crimes being committed. But in general, I mean, this is sort of part of the broader issue on the Armenian side, I think, and this is another thing that morphed over time, going back to our earlier conversation too, and that when the Karabakh Armenian forces in 1993 conquered all these 7 surrounding areas, that was always with the understanding that, we're going to give these back in some sort of deal, in some sort of peace deal. And, these were not part of the homeland, these places where no Armenians actually lived, and still today, almost no one lived. But then attitudes over that hardened over time, and we ended up, I reread a really good piece from 2 years ago, just the other day, saying that, in 2004, 2/3 of Armenians were prepared to give up those territories, part of all of those 7 occupied territories in exchange for a deal. And then by 2018, the number had dropped to 8%. And so, you saw this in the way that Karabakh itself was conceptualized, in terms of those went from being the 7 occupied regions, and then they went to the security belt, and then the buffer zone, and then the liberated areas, and then they were just incorporated fully into Artsakh, and the narrative morphed in terms of this is the buffer zone, back into these are part of the homeland and not 1 inch back, and no one was prepared to give them up too. And so I think, at a certain level, I do think that there was this lack of willingness, especially in terms of the one actor that mattered the most, which was Russia, in terms of the Russians were never going to come in there and fight for Armenia's right to hold Jabrail and Fuzuli. Flat out. And I don't think they ever promised that they would. And I think they made the Armenians very aware of this, at least the leadership. And so I think that's reflective of other people's attitudes towards this as well, as the fact is that, that the issue itself was not so black and white as it would have been if it was just Karabakh itself. It wasn't Karabakh itself. It was also the 7 regions.
Yeah, but the international community has, I think that the problem is that they do not understand why those 7 regions have been so important, because the insurance of having the status for Nagorno-Karabakh and having the peace, and it has been so vague, like nothing substantial has been proposed for many years. And talking about the OSCE, we have seen that the co-chairs have visited Baku and Yerevan and have received quite a cold welcome in Baku, and more diplomatic, softer welcome as always in Yerevan. So would you say that there is still a kind of role for OSCE in the further regulation of the conflict? I'm not sure if we should call it a conflict anymore.
Maybe again eventually, but frankly, no, not really. But because essentially now the only actor that really matters is Russia. The OSCE, the Minsk group hadn't done anything there just frankly had not been concerted efforts by a lot of sides in negotiations for a long time. Essentially the entire Serge Sargsyan presidency, Serge's policy was sit on it, was buy time and wait it out. and so has never made any attempts to do that. And I don't think that Ilham Aliyev was particularly interested either. I think that, after Haydar Aliyev passed away in 2003, that chances fell significantly, but certainly around like the late 2000s, that's when things really just began to get set in their way. And basically a lot of foreign sides spent a lot of political capital on this at various points. I mean, the U.S. did, of course, especially in early 2001 with the Key West talks, and then that was still pre 9/11, and after that it was global war on terror, and that's been the mass preoccupation. And they spent time on, and then that was sort of like that was a pretty big investment of political attention and capital by the U.S. on a small region far away that frankly doesn't have much to do with it. And for the rest of the OSCE too, I mean, there was like some serious efforts in the 90s and the early 2000s to really get things done. But then aside from that, like these countries had largely, Russia obviously had no interest Russia was fine with the status quo, selling weapons to both sides. And the other OSCE Minsk group chairs both have other priorities as well, had already put in a bunch of time. And then also without that U.S. political capital, it's hard to see how they would have gotten much done themselves either. I mean, even the lead up to this. And now, I mean, the Minsk group is basically, I'm sure it'll have some nominal role in whatever status negotiations are going to come forward. But even then, it's way too early to talk about any of that because Aliyev just says no. He says status yok. You're not going to get any status. Noldu Pashinya. What happened? And so obviously this is not something that's on the table for them. And then, I mean, not only did Aliyev say straight up to the Minsk group when they came there that I didn't invite you, I don't know why you're here, but you decided to show up. But then when they came here too, Arya Karatunyan refused to meet them. He said, well, what's the point? And so both sides are, and I'm sure, in Yerevan, okay, but obviously the government here is a bit bigger problems than figuring out the status of the Minsk group. And whoever... In the event that they're replaced by these 17 parties or whatever, which I don't think they will be, but whatever comes next is not going to be particularly interested in the Minsk group either. So the Minsk group is basically, it's a nominal body that I'm sure will attach its name to whatever comes next if and when it does. But I think the Minsk group already for so many years was a very marginal player, and now it's essentially done.
Regarding the human rights organizations and their reports that Amnesty and Human Rights Watch have done a couple of reports during the war. And all those reports have been contested a lot. They have been labeled as controversial, incomplete, unfair, or some way biased. I mean, I don't want to go deep into the content of the reports, but would you say that the MSF has been really overreacting, or there has certainly been a certain kind of bias in favor of Azerbaijan in those reports?
I mean, I don't know if bias I don't particularly think Amnesty and International or Human Rights Watch are biased organizations, but I definitely those reports absolutely left a lot to be desired. And I mean, one of the researchers at Amnesty did a good thread about it afterwards, explaining what happened, saying this is not meant to be the definitive report. We wanted to put this out specifically because those Azerbaijani videos of executions came out, which was a good explainer too, but doesn't change the fact that the report itself doesn't say that. And the report, if you just read, the summary of the report itself, it just says there's been three executions total that we've confirmed, 2 by Azerbaijan, 1 by Armenia, and then all these other war crimes, and the Armenians have actually done more of them. And I mean, and that just is, you have to verify more, but that picture, I think we all know, is not true, that the Armenians have done more or worse, which is not specifically, the report doesn't say that, but the report implies that, and it very clearly reads as that. And it's already been waved around by a bunch of Azeri officials to see, look, well, the Armenians are worse than us. Look at this. See, the Amnesty said the Armenians are worse. And, to have a clarifying thread by one of the researchers is nice, but it doesn't, that's going to be seen by a lot less people than if that was an explanatory note in the report itself, which left a lot to be desired. And so, I am not particularly, I don't think those reports have much value to offer. And I don't understand why the point was of putting it out there, saying, we wanted to put this out there because we'd seen these horrific Azeri videos. but then it's also incomplete. But then it also the conclusions that it gives make it sound to everyone who's not following this internal sort of drama closely, make it sound to everyone else who's reading the report that actually look, the Armenian side is much worse. And so yeah, I don't know what they were thinking with that. I think it was very poorly thought out, and the Human Rights Watch one were better still, but I mean there was also problems with that, saying like it said the Armenian side committed war crimes, and then it said the Azerbaijani side apparently committed war crimes, and the picture on the front of the one of the Azerbaijanis committing war crimes was just like an empty street hit by a missile, and then the picture in the front of the Armenian committing war crimes one was like a crying child. So obviously a very different like emotional touchstone there too. It makes it look much worse than that. So I think that they were pretty either tone deaf or just sort of oblivious, or just fairly poorly planned out, really. Yeah, I think that there was a lot that could have been done a lot better with those, and myself, I was not pleased with them.
Okay, and going back to the journalistic aspect of your work, do you think that as a foreign journalist you have been assisted enough in Armenia by the authorities? You were stuck on the border, you couldn't get into Artsakh at some point, I remember.
Yeah, I mean, I think broadly speaking, there weren't any restrictions that were that were beyond the pale. I mean, there was a lot of confusion in the process, and then like every day the regulations were sort of changing, or a lot of things were being done on the fly, and there was a lot of confusion. And yeah, the first time I tried to get into Artsakh, we were unable to. But that was also, I mean, that day, the bridge near Lachin had been hit by the Azerbaijani missile during that day. And then the next 2 days, I mean, Stepanakert was being shelled so heavily that I don't think it was really unjustifiable that they didn't want people going in there then. And then being in Karabakh itself too, I mean, you really didn't have much access, frankly, in terms of, you could go around in Stepanakert, and you could go to Shushi, and you could go to Martkert and Martuni sometimes, and that was about it. And obviously the authorities sort of were more interested in you writing just sort of the stories about how people are in the shelters and they're sad and it's tragic, and not that much else. But then at the same time, so we couldn't get close to the real action in the front line in the south. Some people managed to with the aid of very clever fixers, but broadly you could not. But then at the same time too, this was the sort of war where for the entire time the Azeris had full control of the skies, and drones were it wasn't just the sort of war where you can embed in a unit, okay, there's small arm and artillery fire, and if you get close to the front lines, the risks and etc. But this was thing where vehicles and military looking vehicles are being struck by guided munitions all across Karabakh the whole time. So it was legitimately a really big risk to send people anywhere closer to the actual front lines of the fighting. So I do have a hard time faulting the authorities on not letting people do that. And so I think broadly overall, maybe it could have been nicer to have a little bit more access into the actual crucial areas of the fighting in the south, but I don't think it was unreasonable that there were the restrictions that there were in place. Yeah, there were some Armenian journalists that managed to get really interesting access, and especially certain ones like Bars Media. I don't know how they were given some sort of really special access, clearly. I know some other Armenian journalists who were able to embed with units, and as a foreign journalist that was not possible. And actually now there's preferential treatment being given to Russian journalists, where in Stepanakert, the Artsakh authorities are organizing special tours for only Russian journalists and not allowing foreign journalists on them. So now that's a different story. But overall, I don't think the restrictions were super unreasonable during the war.
Mm-hmm. And the final question is, what are the 3 key developments or actors that you as a foreign journalist would keep your eye on in 2021 about the war and the region in general?
Haven't had that much time to look to the future, but I guess just, how well will the ceasefire hold, of course, because there's been lots of violations. I was in a village last week, in Tokhavar village where it was being violated at that moment. And will the Russians manage to put a real end to this, or will this be like sort of the new normal with sniping and skirmishes across the front line despite the Russian presence? Because there aren't that many, there aren't enough Russians to be everywhere. There's quite a few Russians, but they're not everywhere, and not in these areas where the violations have happened. So will the Russians put a real end to that? And then going forward, I mean, well, the political scene in Yerevan, of course, what is going to happen exactly here? When will Pashinyan, because I think he must realize he has to call snap elections at some point. When will that happen? And then what exactly will the outcome of that be? And then let's say what happens in Azerbaijan, because this was always the issue that held everything together there. That was the government used it as carte blanche to do whatever they wanted. And now, okay, you got back Karabakh, and you can't really get back the rest of it because the Russians are there and they're not just going to leave. And now, of course, wartime is over, and so the wartime solidarity is going to start to fade, and it already has in terms of, when the government announced there that the compensation for the families of deceased soldiers, Azerbaijani soldiers, was going to be one-time payment of 300 manats, about $170. Azerbaijani social media was very upset about that. And now there's other reports that, the soldiers are not getting adequate treatment, and that they're not getting adequate food and payment afterwards. And so people are going to be upset about that. And then, of course, as this reconstruction stuff starts to come in, it's going to cost a lot of money on an Azerbaijani state budget that has shrunk massively in the last few years and is not going to go back up because it's an oil-based economy. And so a huge slice of this decreased pie is going to go towards these prestige projects of building whatever in Shushi and the big highway going up from Fuzuli up to there. And then I'm sure they're going to build a few little Potemkin village style settlements and these liberated areas, as quote unquote, that are going to cost a lot of money, and that frankly I don't think many people are going to move back to in these areas. I mean, these areas that were largely rural, people who have been living on the outskirts of Baku for 25 years, largely are not going to go back, and especially people who've grown up there now are not going to go from living in Baku to being farmers 400 kilometers away. And so I think that's going to be very interesting to watch inside Azerbaijan.
Thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. And we'll hope to see you in Armenia, in future, and hopefully to read more your coverage of the region.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. And I'm not planning to leave the Caucasus, broadly speaking, anytime in the next few years. I'm planning to still be based here, so I'm sure there'll be plenty more coverage of Karabakh coming from you.